Hi folks, Chuck Black here. We are doing our Quokka walkthrough. We're talking about the initialization of our application within Flask. We're in the fourth week of talking about the Quokka, as I call it. And in this particular lesson, we're going to be talking about how we will be initializing our relationship to the SQL database we use and in which we store all of our data. So without further ado, let's get started with the lesson. Okay, so we're talking about initialization, and specifically in the code, our init.py code, the lines we're going to be looking at, there's only two of them. One of them is an import, and one of them is going to say create all. It would be a very short lesson if I said, that's it, good luck with it, you're on your own. But I'd like to explain a few things about what actually is going on. And in order to do that, we need to take a couple of steps back and understand what exactly we're talking about when we talk about this database. Now, one thing I can show you, I'll give you a quick peek at right here. This is the host database. I am inside Postgres. I am printing out everything from the host table. And you can see here's all of my host information. If I was to go to Quokka over here and we were to look at hosts, you would see the information in the database is going to be roughly the same as the information in here. Now here it's sorted and by IP address, and we can do other stuff with it. Down here it's in the database, so it's more of a raw format, but you can see a lot of the same fields that you see up there: last heard, response time, MAC address, etc. So this is actually looking at the physical database that we have created. In order to go into this a little bit more and to understand exactly what's going on, we need to look at what is going on with the database that we're using. We are using an SQL database, and specifically the one that we're using happens to be Postgres. We looked before at the fact that we can use multiple different types of SQL databases. I've used SQLite, and currently I'm using Postgres. But let's take a step back even from that and say, okay, well, what is this SQL thing? Well, if you want to understand a little bit, there's really two different types of major database models that people use today. One is an SQL type model that falling into this category would be Postgres, which is really PostgreSQL. It ends in SQL. Also, MySQL is another one that costs money. Postgres is open source and free. SQLite is also free, and it's not really for production. This we'll talk about. You can just Google SQL versus NoSQL database. It'll talk to you about different aspects of them. Let me give you the Chuck Black super duper high level overview. In an SQL database, you define a number of tables that have relationships with one another. And the things that you define are pretty much fixed. In other words, you may have 5 or 10 or 15 tables. They may involve relationships, and these will all have fields or columns that are going to be pretty much fixed. And the definitions are going to exist a priori. That means when you create the database, you're going to define these relationships and you will be living with it. The good side of SQL in that is that your definition exists and you can compare to make sure that wrong things are not happening. Here you see an example from a tutorial. It's called sqlservertutorial.net. I'm sure there are many others. I just did a quick Google search and found one that had a halfway decent picture that I could show you. This is showing customers, orders, stores, order items, what stock is available in the different stores for the different products and how many of them, what are the products, etc., etc. You get the general idea. This is what an SQL database looks like. And since we're not going into NoSQL databases, I'm not going to show you pictures of those in order to keep from confusing you. But what it generally is, you have documents that you define, and these are pretty much free form, and the relationships between information in your various documents is kept inside the document itself, and it can change. It's fluid, it's dynamic. It makes it much easier to migrate as opposed to SQL, but it affords less comparison and error checking and things of that nature. If you were to go in here, you would get a little bit of information about that. I have no idea if they talk about this. Be aware that if you go into one like MongoDB, which happens to be NoSQL, I haven't actually looked at this, but they will, since their interest is in promoting NoSQL databases, they may have a biased view. Or they may be completely open and honest about it, who knows. But just be aware of that. Okay, so we've looked a little bit about this. Now, I did, we're using SQL Alchemy. I want to go to a tutorial that explains in very simple language how to set one up. So I went to the SQL Alchemy tutorial, how to easily set this up. I don't know if it advertises itself as easily. And I began to go through here, and I started to look at stuff, and I said, okay, I understand this, but is my audience going to understand this? Creating an engine, declaring a mapping, talking about defining a table in that particular way, inheriting from a base table. All this stuff is entirely valid, and if you have experience with this, more power to you. You can go down in that. I suspect if you went to other places like Tutorials Point or other, there may be simpler versions of tutorials. Maybe I should have said simple tutorial or something, but there are a number of tutorials. There may even be a Flask SQL Alchemy tutorial, so there may be some of them there. But I think also the tutorial that you're going to get in these videos is going to be adequate. I can tell you that the way that I've done it is not a cheap and easy way of doing it. It is at least advanced in the last project that I worked on, which is for a major, huge financial institution doing network automation. So I think we'd all better hope that this is an adequate way to do it. Otherwise, if your credit cards stop working, then, well, I'm not going to say that it was this particular one, but yeah, anyway, you get the idea. I think that the way that I did it is the simplest and the most straightforward. So we're going to look at this. And what we're going to be talking about eventually are these two lines of code. Now, one thing that I want you to be aware of is this. I'm using Postgres. In fact, I'm going to scroll back up here. Remember this thing? I don't want to get rid of this page because I'll have to bring it up again, so I'm going to make it skinny. Remember, this is what I did initially with SQLite. This is what I'm doing with Postgres, where I'm referring to this Quokka database. And you may say, well, that looks like magical mumbo jumbo. I have no idea what that is doing. And I can tell you really quickly, with SQLite, what it's doing is this is referring to a specific file in which it kept all of its data. And when we're specifying it like this, we're referring to a database name because we're using a real live database system called Postgres. And what exactly is it and how did I set it up? Well, you could read about Postgres if you want. This is the picture of the database that we're using in Quokka. If I was to go here, I've expanded my list of all of the pages so that I can easily go to my Quokka VM installed software. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll down here towards the bottom. You see all the stuff that we've installed for the user interface, etc. Aha, here's stuff that I did for Postgres. Now I did this in kind of a pseudocode back of the napkin way of describing it. Some of it is not exact, but this part is exact. I have installed Postgres, and what I've done is I've started it, and then inside it I've created a user. I've called that user Quokka, and what I've done is I have created a database which also happens to be named quokka. And as I look at this, I'm thinking, okay, that my documentation may be incorrect. These are clearly redundant. And I'm not sure which of these. I need to go back and figure out which one I actually did on the database. If you have the Quokka VM, you can probably do a history and you may see something that has the one that I actually did. But this is the database, and what you will end up doing is create db quokka. And what you will see me doing at various times is I'm going to bring up another terminal window. Actually, I'm going to create a new terminal window, and I'm going to show you that what I can say here is I can say create db, and I could specify quokka. Now I've already created that, and I can also say drop db, and I can say drop db quokka, and that's what I will end up doing on my system when things get screwed up, which they haven't done in a long time. But if you get in situations where you just want to eradicate all of the data, and we'll go into that later when we talk more about databases. But the point that I wanted to make is that probably this is sufficient right here. This creates my database. So let's assume that I've created this database either using this. In this situation, I'm going in as super user and saying the user is called Postgres and I'm creating the db quokka, or if I'm just creating it as myself on the terminal window. Whatever way I've done that, I've created this database. And like I say, we'll go into the details of that later. I will have cleaned that up. But what we want to talk about is this piece right here. This is where we say where we're going to set up all the database stuff. Now there's two important parts of this, which I'm going to go through in a fair amount of detail. So here's our two lines of code. First, we're going to import quokka.models, and then we're going to do db.createAll. So let's look at this first statement, import quokka.models. Now we've seen import statements before. We looked at importing views. We've imported functions from modules. We've imported whole modules, etc. This dot notation references folders. So this would be quokka/views/worker views. I'm not sure I mentioned that last time, but that's how things are structured. If you see a dot, that means that's a directory. This is a folder, that's a folder, that's a folder, etc. So here we say quokka.models, and we would expect that to be like these are all Python modules. And we looked here, okay, is there a Python module called models? And if I look in here, quokka models, hang on a minute, that's not a Python module, that's an actual Python package. So you would be asking yourself, does that mean that I'm importing this entire package, which is like a subdirectory, but it's special in Python because it has this init file in it, as we mentioned earlier? Am I going to import everything? And the answer to that question is yes, we're going to import everything from quokka.models. Now, if you look at this, you can see, well, there's a lot of stuff in there. Let me go back and reference what we were looking at before. Remember, we were looking at our Quokka hosts file. Let me make this a little bit bigger so it's easier to see, and let me get rid of this one. So when we when we looked at everything in host, that's what we saw. There are different ways to specify looking at various things, and every implementation of SQL, meaning SQLite versus Postgres versus MySQL, they all have different commands for looking at stuff. And so the command that I'm going to use, in fact, why don't I just do this? I'm going to do Control-D and get out of here. So now I've exited. I'm back at the command line. And the command that I did to look at Quokka, the Quokka database, is I'm just able to say PSQL Quokka. So because I have defined the user in the appropriate way, I'm able to say PSQL Quokka, and this will take me into the Quokka database. This is what this is telling me here. I'm at the Quokka database. This is the command prompt. So what I said before was I said select star from host, the host table, and I hit tab to have it give me my options, and the table I want to look at is host. The kind of unique or queer or weird thing about database command line, for SQL anyway, is you almost always have to specify a semicolon at the end. And so here I say select star from host. If I was to say select star from host and I forget to put a semicolon, it comes back and it looks like that. And you say to yourself, what? What didn't you like about that? What it didn't like was it didn't like that I forgot the semicolon. Here I give the semicolon, and now I can see all of these. But if I wanted to say, okay, well, that's great, but we're not looking at this right now, and I'm not getting into the details of this. I just kind of want to see what is in this database. In other words, what tables exist. So I'm going to do a command. You can Google this to find out how do you show the tables in Postgres. If I do \DT, that is going to give me a list of tables that exist in my database. So I have a table that is called capture. I have a table called command. I have a table called compliance. If you're looking over here, you're probably seeing, oh, there's capture, there's command, there's compliance, there's device config. And now you're starting to say, well, I could deal with the fact that this is small c and this is a big C. Maybe that doesn't matter. But why did it get, it basically took what we call camel case, where you have capital letters specifying the different words, and it inserted an underscore, and it has everything in small letters. Why is that? Well, this is the word, the name for the table that exists in the SQL database itself in Postgres. And this is the Python name of the class that we're going to define in order to use SQL Alchemy. Okay, over here's the actual database name, and here is the class name that we've defined that is appropriate for SQL Alchemy. This is the SQL Alchemy world over here in Python. This is the SQL world here in Postgres. So somehow it's able to map those. This is the default mapping. It will go from capital to small, but you'll also see that we help it out by giving it the name when we go into that a little bit. But here you can see there's an actual database on my system that has this information in it. Okay, let's get rid of that. Now what we want to do, we're saying import Quokka models. It's going to go through and it's going to try to import each one of these. And for now, what we care about is not these APIs. Those are a bunch of functions that I've created that actually do database stuff. So this is like the front end for my database. If I want to get host summary data, then I call this function that I wrote called get host summary data, and it's able to do that. If I just want to get status data, which is only like for an hour typically, or maybe the last 60, then I will go here and call that. We seem to be very host centric. We're not, here's device status, I can get that. Here is service information. So there's all of these things here. In fact, if you look, you can see, whoa, this is a really long file, dude. And you're right, it is a very long file. You can see it has 1,000 lines in it. I've thought to myself, I really had to break this up so that I had just separate files for devices versus hosts versus services. I may or may not do that. But that's my APIs, and for our purposes of starting up the database, that's not really of huge interest to us. That is just Python code. But what is of interest to us are going to be these SQL Alchemy. Remember, we're doing SQL Alchemy stuff. Here's our SQL Alchemy class. We created an object that is pointing at SQL Alchemy class, And now I'm going to say, hey, my database, SQL Alchemy database, I want you to create everything. And what is it going to create? Well, each one of these that you see, we're going to look at it in just a minute, but you see these are all tables in the database, if you remember what we were looking at. And so SQL Alchemy, behind the scenes, this is some of the magical stuff that is done for us. We don't have to do it. It is going to set up the relationship between my Python code and that database that it exists out there with Postgres. And this code is exactly the same whether I'm using Postgres or whether I'm using SQLite. MySQL I've used also. All right, so we're doing this import, Quakkadot models, and I mentioned that these are the important ones, the ones that you see that start with a capital letter. Those are classes, and most likely they are going to be SQL Alchemy classes. So let's go to one. Let's go to the host one, since we've been talking about hosts. It's not unique, but it's fairly simple because we don't have a whole lot of stuff defined for it. So I'm going to double click on host, and here is my host Python file. Okay, so let's begin to go through here, and we're going to go into these in greater detail later on. But this is what is getting imported. Basically, we have this import statement. Now, you will notice, remember we talked last week about circular imports, and you have to be careful of those. In this situation, this doesn't cause us problems. Remember, init.py defined DB, and that allows me to use DB here. So I'm using DB, and what I'm going to say, host is what I've defined. We haven't gotten into object-oriented stuff yet, but for SQL Alchemy, it's fairly straightforward. I'm defining this class, and this class is going to represent my database table. And let's just have a look at it. This thing in parentheses says, basically think of it like this. This is really inheriting the characteristics of a model from SQL Alchemy. Remember DB? What is DB? It's right here. It's an SQL Alchemy object. So db.model, that's something that comes from this SQL Alchemy magical stuff. And I'm going to inherit characteristics of that. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify the table name. You'll notice when we looked at our table, the actual name, I'm specifying explicitly. A lot of times it's not required that you specify the table name, but in this case, I am. Why is it called table name? Why does it have underscores in front of it and after it? Why it's called table name is because that's the name that SQL Alchemy uses. So you need to be looking at SQL Alchemy stuff. Why does it have underscores before and after it? Because that's what we do when we talk about internal variables. It does nothing other than visually identifies this particular name as something that is meant to be used internally. So that's all you need to know about that. Now, my stuff. What things are I defining? What things am I defining? Still learning English here. My first programming language, my first language is Java and then English. And now I guess Python you'd say. So here I am. I'm defining something called ID. I'm defining another thing called name. I'm defining another thing called IP address, another thing called MAC address. These three are basically the things that I learn and I store related to hosts that I discover. So I get its name, I get its IP address, and I get its MAC address if I can. If I can't find it, then I leave that blank. All right? So let's just think about this for a second. Now, remember our cool quokka information. Let's stick with hosts. I'm glad that this is turning out correctly. Look at this information, response time and availability. Well, hey, that's pretty cool. Look at in here. I have response time and availability. But let's not confuse ourselves, all right? Let's pause for a second. Remember, when I go to hosts, what am I showing here? I'm showing response time, and I'm showing the current status. And that is what I'm storing. I have one entry in here for this. Oops, sorry. That's availability and response time right there. Okay? That is what I'm storing. This is an instant in time, the information that I have. And you've seen that last heard. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of this. I will tell you that there's also a host status, and that's going to keep availability and response time over time. This is time series data. Host status summary is the same type of thing, availability and response time, but it keeps it on an hourly basis. There's a bunch of other stuff in here. I have table for device. As you might expect, it has a lot more information in it. Look at all that information. So for devices, I'm keeping a whole lot of important information. Device config, you can see that it's a small table, it's a small class, as I said, with not much data, but it has some really important stuff like this. This is the data in the database that stores the configuration that allows us to do config diff. All right, so there's a number of things in here. There's tables for workers, which has a little bit of interesting information. There's a worker status table, etc. These are the things that are getting imported by init.py. When I say import, it's going to make Python aware of all of these items. And now what's going to happen when I go through here and I say db.createAll, if those tables do not exist, it will create them. If they do exist, it is just making SQL Alchemy, specifically my variable called db, which is of type SQL Alchemy class. It's going to make db aware of all of those different things. Now, how do I know that createAll is going to either create the tables if they don't exist, or it will just make reference to them and make sure that Python and DB is able to be aware of those when we go to use them later on? How do I know that? Well, because I Googled SQL Alchemy and looked up createAll, and it basically said that's exactly what it's going to do. So this is just a tiny taste of the database stuff for how all of this gets set up and how all of it works. We're gradually going through all of the information for initialization, and this is what we do in order to make our database reference the appropriate stuff, which would be the tables that you see over here. Okay, so as I like to do, let's review what we talked about. We talked about how Quokka uses a database and how just these two lines right here are the lines that allowed us to make our application aware of all of the database stuff going on. We talked about how SQL databases differ from NoSQL. If you want to look into that, you can. We're using an SQL database. We looked at the general idea of SQL databases, that you have tables and they have relationships. We'll be going into this later on, but that's kind of what you need to know. There's a bunch of tables. We looked a little bit at this tutorial, but found that some of them are very complicated. You might try to look at other ones. When we finished understanding this, we looked a little bit at how Quokka actually uses Postgres. And so we looked here. Here's the installation for everything, and down here you see there's special stuff for doing Postgres. So we saw how that worked. We looked a little bit at the tables that exist and how we've defined these model classes that define all the different tables, and by simply doing this import and then a createAll, it helps us to be able to reference what actually is the database out there. And we looked a little bit at various information. We looked at all the tables. We looked at the host table, etc. Hopefully this has given you a little bit of a taste for how we're using databases and how we specifically, in this case, we're just looking at how we initialized it, which was really pretty simple. The main issue will be how do we know what to put in those databases, and we will be going through all of that as we go through the walkthrough of what each of these models is and what it does. So I hope that's been helpful in understanding how we're initializing the database. And yeah, hope you have a good understanding of this now, and that it's proving to be helpful to see how Quokka goes through initialization, and then in this lesson how it initializes its connection to the database.